Recently, as the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbase has been expanding and growing in size, and even spreading quite heavily to platforms such as TikTok, a somewhat interesting debate has sparked within the community. Does Gojo Satoru, the strongest character in Jujutsu Kaisen's supreme confidence, stem from a god complex, or is Gojo's immense amount of self-confidence merely a byproduct of his insurmountable and unrivaled power? Well, in this video, we're going to be taking a look at Gojo's character and answering the question, does Gojo have a god complex? Now, before I can determine whether or not Gojo has a true god complex, a definition that I'll be using throughout this video must be established. For the sake of this video, a god complex will be defined as the unshakable belief in oneself, characterized by constantly inflated feelings of ability, privilege, or infallibility. People with god complexes tend to push their own personal ideas as undoubtedly correct and rarely have regard for the societal norms of their environment. When we take this definition and apply it to Gojo, we can see very clearly that at least on a surface level, these things seem to apply and fit his character. From his introduction into the series, we see that even when faced with a vessel that is holding a special grade item, Gojo cannot and does not take his opponent seriously and toys around with them, beating him senselessly and even being rather performative in terms of how he fights. With him making declarations boasting his immense power and might, it's clear to see that at the bare minimum, Gojo has immense and massive amounts of self-confidence and awareness of his abilities. This constant braggadocious nature of his is something that he never really gets rid of or even attempts to hide. Even when faced with unregistered special grade curses that are advanced enough to speak and set up multi-layer attack strategies, Gojo has the audacity to say that this cursed spirit is weak. Needless to say that Gojo has made the claim and clearly thinks that he is the strongest creature alive in the Jujutsu Kaisen world, as he has stated multiple times. Now, where many people would conflate having an ego or having self-pride and confidence as a god complex, I personally am able to recognize that this cannot be the case, at least in the very specific and unique case of Gojo Satoru. If you guys remember correctly from earlier in the video, in order to have a god complex, your belief in your own ability must not only be unshakable, but it must be inflated. And while I'll address the unshakability of Gojo's beliefs in a bit, what we can address is the idea of his ego or belief in his abilities being inflated. In my mind, in order to have your ego be inflated or have an inflated ego, you have to have a belief in ability that simply does not exist. And this ego tends to toe the line into simple arrogance or overconfidence. Vegeta from Dragon Ball Z is a pretty good example of this. While he is prideful and declares himself to be the strongest character in the universe similarly to Gojo, we are shown time and time again that these beliefs are founded in absolutely nothing, meaning that this declaration doesn't come from a place of knowledge or understanding of himself or his opponent, but it comes from ignorance and an unshakable feeling of superiority and pride that isn't rooted in any form of fact or logic. In Gojo's case, it's quite a bit different. Does Gojo have an ego similar to Vegeta? Yes. Does Gojo think very highly of himself, at least in regard to his power as the strongest? Yes. But is this confidence misplaced or incorrect in any way? Well, you may already be able to tell based off of my tone from this video, but no. For every boast and brag that he's laid out, his actions and feats have backed that up. When going up against Ryomen Sukuna for the first time, he doesn't have a single worry about losing or even taking damage, and lo and behold, he doesn't. He completely overwhelmed and overpowered his opponent to the point where Sukuna had absolutely no hope of touching him. Versus Jogo, when he declared that he was weak, he wasn't really wrong. At least in relation to his own power, Jogo was nothing but a fly that was messing around ready to be swatted. Upon opening his domain expansion, his greatest attack, Jogo gets completely and easily overwhelmed by Gojo Satoru without so much as a drop of sweat or a hint of worry. Both of these are simply a microcosm of the many examples that Gojo gives to us, displaying his unrivaled pride and power. But let's take a look at one more extremely prideful and confident quote that Gojo has and see if this may change up the status quo. In an arc that takes place in the manga, Gojo is fighting against someone before he makes a quote that is pretty famous in Buddhist beliefs. Throughout the heavens and the earth, I alone am the honored one. Upon making this quote, Gojo unleashes his most powerful attack yet, finishing the battle. Now, I have seen time and time again people misinterpret and misunderstand this line. And in fact, even I have looked at this line as a sign of arrogance and disregard for anyone but himself, but when placed in the context of this arc, it doesn't really show that Gojo is an arrogant character. It shows an ascent into godhood in terms of power and cursed energy manipulation that up to this point was never really seen before. As his understanding of cursed energy grew and he became drunk on his own power, his pace of speech sped up, his demeanor changed from his casual stance, and in fact his opponent actually thinks that he is high based off of the way that he's talking, and it shows that Gojo was evolving at a pace that surprised both him and his opponent. What makes this quote so important and impressive is the fact that Gojo is actually correct in several ways here. The Honored One quote stems from Buddhist religion and ideas, as many Jujutsu Kaisen concepts do, and this quote specifically was made by Buddha directly after being born. Similarly, Gojo upon his rebirth, or the birth into his role as the strongest sorcerer, started directly before this quote. Alongside this, what this quote means is that Gojo as a human, as a shaman, and as the strongest, understands his value and worth. Saying that he is the Honored One here is making a declaration of self-importance and pride. This isn't to say that Gojo quite literally thinks that he's the only one that matters. In fact, this is directly contradicted because we see time and time again that Gojo trusts and cares about his students and those around him, even though 9 times out of 10 they are drastically weaker than him. What Gojo is doing here, and honestly what one of the overarching themes of Jujutsu Kaisen, is that breaking down your own mental barriers and roadblocks and growing on your own selfishly without any regard for others is the greatest way to develop and improve on a personal level. And as soon as Gojo did this, he evolved into the being that we know him as today. Now, if you guys remember correctly, earlier in this video I mentioned 2 key parts of the God complex that need to be addressed within the realm of this discussion. The first one is one that we've already covered. The conclusion drawn here is that Gojo does not have an inflated ego or overconfidence in himself, because he truly does back up everything that he says with feats, and these words are never hollow in their meaning. But the second part, the unshakable beliefs in his ability, is somewhat of a more tricky part to dissect. Because while on one hand Gojo does completely understand how strong he is, and is unshakable in the belief that he is truly strong, he also acknowledges several times in the series that there are characters in the verse that have the potential to, and most likely will, surpass him and the special grade class in terms of power. So we find ourselves in a bit of a situation where it's hard to define what exactly constitutes unshakable belief in one's ability. So in order to ease this strain and make it much easier to fully understand, let's compare Gojo to another character who is constantly stated to have a god complex. Let's compare Gojo Satoru to Light Yagami. When it comes to Death Note and Light Yagami more specifically, the claim that he has a god complex is not one that is hard to prove, considering that he fits all of these stated above criteria easily. Light has a supreme level of arrogance in himself as a person, believing that he is the only person who is able to wield the Death Note in a proper manner and change the world, with no real foundation for this reasoning. The reason this is different from Gojo's own ego is a difference in their feats and levels of importance relative to their own universe. Light, before the Death Note, is just an above average intelligence teenager who was set on following in his father's footsteps and becoming a detective. Outside of the Death Note, the only thing that makes Light truly special is an immense amount of intelligence. But even this is completely surpassed by the likes of L and Nier in the series, showing that this pride in himself for his competence simply isn't something that is truly earned or deserved, considering the fact that he isn't unrivaled in this degree. And when it comes to belief in his ability, Light is also clearly unshakable. In fact, when letting those around him wield the same power as him, he only does so strictly to manipulate them and use them to push his own agenda, because he doesn't trust that they'd be able to do so on their own. He has confidence to manipulate people in this manner because he can't even fathom the idea of himself, of Kira, being outsmarted, outplayed, or manipulated. Which is why when characters such as L, or really any other character trying to catch Kira and succeeding, push him or puts him in a bad position, he is fueled with uncontrollable fits of rage and anger. Because to him, all they are merely mortals that are trying to fight against the will of a god. And to further back this up, L in fact states that in order to kill in the way that he does, Light must have already reached god complex levels of delusion because of how easily and calmly he can take a fellow human being's life. Upon comparing a character such as Light to Gojo, I think it becomes painfully clear that a god complex is not something that he has. The unshakable belief that I described using Light as a measuring stick simply does not apply to Gojo in the same way. In fact, we have direct evidence that not only does Gojo not want to take on the world and change it by himself, but he doesn't even think he can, or at least not in the ideal way. While he could kill all the higher-ups of the Jujutsu world, that wouldn't accomplish his goal of true reform and change. He recognizes his own self-importance and has confidence in himself, yes, but he doesn't delude himself thinking that he is the only one that can handle anything or that he alone can change the entirety of the world. We see this culminate to an almost reckless degree where in the biggest and most impactful arc of Jujutsu Kaisen, Gojo leaves everything to his students and allies and places his wholehearted trust within them. This is not the action that someone with a god complex would take, no. For Gojo, his attitude is something much less simple than that of a god complex. What I think Gojo represents, not only for the audience, but for the characters in Jujutsu Kaisen, is the pinnacle of humanity, and in fact, even is a display of how a human can take a step past the realm of mortality and humanity and into the world of the gods. Now, I know that even with all of the in-depth explanation as to why Gojo definitively doesn't have a god complex, using evidence shown in the series, relatively well put together logic, and even use of other characters with that complex as a measuring stick, people will still find a way to disagree with me and say that I'm wrong in the comments. But you know, I'm okay with that at this point. All I can hope for is that this video was not only educational, but an entertaining dive into god complexes as a concept and the psyche of Gojo Satoru. If you guys enjoyed this video and want to see me do similar videos where I talk about Gojo being the true monster of Jujutsu Kaisen, cursed energy being the best power system, or other JJK analysis videos, I'll be linking my 40+ video playlist where I strictly talk about Jujutsu Kaisen for you guys to watch and enjoy at your own leisure. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you guys are notified to my uploads. And as always, this is Broken Ronin, signing off.